Okay, greetings and welcome to the Saroff the Mage Experiment. Today we have a very special guest, very talented and beautiful man called Julian Vayne. You are an author, a magician, a teacher. You write the blog of Baphomet. You've got your wonderful YouTube channel, Deep Magic, where you've been doing that groovy My Magical thing. You've had all kinds of wonderful people on there, really interesting selection of people from all the different little, you've had Jake Stratton-Kent, Carl Abrahamson, loads of people. You're possibly best known as a chaos magician, but I was also interested to learn that you're a master mason and a Wiccan. Julian Vayne, welcome to my experiment.
Oh, Sarah, it's fantastic to be here in the experiment with your good self. So thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for accepting so quickly. I kind of dropped you a cheeky little text yesterday, not really expecting you to come on. And not only did you come on, but you came on so quickly that, very, very nice of you, very kind of you. So let's start the conversation at a place that I love to, people that know my channel will know that I love to talk about psychedelics. Part of my first magical awakening was when I was about 13. Down at the Duffy Park, my mates just picked up, some older brother had told us that if you take these mushrooms, it kind of makes you feel funny. And I wasn't prepared in any way for the life-changing kind of effect that they had. It was suddenly like I was in the same physical location, but it was like the filters had been removed. I was talking to trees. Everything was alive. How do you see the psychedelics' place in this thing that we call magic?
Well, it's such a broad question. There are so many avenues that we might take. I guess thinking back to your early experience, part of what psychedelics as a particular class of psychoactive substances do is that they reveal new aspects of our own awareness and the world. And there's both huge amounts of kind of ancestral lineage, kind of tradition, entheogenic cultures that have used these things, and also, of course, over the last, I don't know, 100 years, let's say, from the kind of the advent of mescaline into European culture at the end of the 19th century, we've had an amazing amount of kind of research and experiment and incursion of psychedelics back into the Western sphere, although they've always really been part of kind of magical and esoteric culture in many respects. So I see the relationship with them as being substances which are exogenous materials that we can take into our bodies that provokes experiences which we can certainly arrive at through a multiplicity of other ways of changing our awareness through breath or through ritual drama, protracted periods of meditation or darkness or any of those kinds of things. So they're another and very rich tool with which we can use to explore our relationship with ourselves and aspects of our own being and our relationship with the wider world.
Yeah. I mean, in my personal experience, I probably wouldn't have well, mind you, I did actually find a book, the Occult Primer by David Conway. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, Magick and Occult Primer. So I found that when I was kind of 12-ish, and I read about this strange place called the astral world. But to me, it seemed like an actual physical location, somewhere where you could kind of step out your body, enter this mythic realm where there were, I was a kid. And then when I took the mushrooms, I kind of made a connection. This is the astral world. It must be. What do you think? How would you define that connection? Because I want to go on to speak about entities as well. So are we, when we take mushrooms, entering the astral plane, or is it somewhere else?
Okay, so I mean, the first thing I have to say is I have no idea. I have no idea how any of this works, frankly. I've got suspicions and thoughts about stuff, inevitably, but I don't know. I think that one way of understanding those things is that they are a lens. The psychedelic experiences are kind of a lens through which we experience the world. And maybe we experience radically different things, which for me lead to an idea that a number of things hold true. The first thing is that it's not quite as literal as one might imagine. Now, I mean, we are these, we're human beings, we're tubes. We spend a lot of time worrying about what's up and down and what's inside and what's outside of the tube. And so we problematize a lot of the relationships. Is it real? Is it not real? And one of the things about Magick is that it's, if you look at, say, Crowley writing about, you know, in his arguably his masterwork, where he says, you know, in this book there are lots of things spoken about of spirits and planes and Sephira and things. Whether they exist or not doesn't really matter. What matters is kind of, you know, our engagement with them. By doing certain things, certain results follow. And that is kind of my, I guess, my overall position on things. I think when we have an experience, it's useful to look at the experience in psychological terms, in mythic terms, perhaps to posit the existence of other realms of being. Anyone who's familiar with the mathematical idea or the literary idea of flatland knows that there are ways of imagining what those things might conceivably be like. But certainly the experience in and of itself seems to me to be tremendously valuable and very, very useful and interesting for people. And the psychedelic experience seems to be very much key to a lot of kind of major religious teachings and unfoldings. It certainly exists within esoteric culture, as I said before. Conway is one kind of example of someone who points to this, but there are other subtler pieces of the storyline in there too. So I don't know whether or not it's about traveling to another world. As humans, we have to use metaphors that include things like traveling. You and I are at the moment connecting, right? So we're doing this through an elaborate series of servers and digital technology. But when I visit a website, I talk about me visiting a website. I don't physically go to anywhere. I click something on a computer. That's what actually happens. And data goes into my eyes and into my mind, and maybe into my ears as well. But we use the metaphor of I have visited the website in the same way that we might use the metaphor of traveling to the astral plane, whether it has to be seen in those literal terms of an actual movement from one location to another mysterious altered dimension. I don't think it's necessarily has to be seen in those terms. What matters is the sense and experience of perhaps a journey. And so we use that language because we have to express things in metaphorical terms.
Absolutely. I think the whole history of religion, spirituality is, you know, metaphors are all that we've got, really. You know, I had a really, a bit of a breakthrough experience lately. I've always been a bit of an overthinker and trying to put everything into these neat little intellectual boxes. You know, which path is the right path? Which God should I worship? And, you know, but then, you know, one of the most famous inspirational lines of all time, nothing is true, everything is permitted. So it kind of, the penny dropped after I'd done a sigil to try and put myself in touch with an august spiritual being who I won't mention. And the very next day it was like, we're free to pick our myths, our stories, you know, because nothing is literally true. You know, the Bible isn't true, Liber Valagus isn't true, the Diamond Sutra isn't absolutely true, you know, so pick it. And since then I've got very freed up, and you know, it saved me a lot of worrying and fussing over stuff that, you know, nothing is true, everything is permitted.
I think having those kind of multiple viewpoints, I think one of the interesting things about contemporary magic in particular is that it strives to, at its best, I think, adopt a number of ways of looking at phenomena, a way of being able to quite happily accept subjective phenomena and say, okay, so your experience was this, fantastic. Assuming you're telling me the truth, I have to kind of sit with your experience as you had that. But also, for me, I guess it's about holding on quite lightly to descriptive tools because, you know, as they say, the map is not the territory. You know, or if you take the example that I often use, if you think of a painting, there are innumerable ways of looking at the painting. You can look at the painting as an art conservator, where you're most interested in the chemical composition of the paint. You can look at it as a gallery visitor, where you're most interested in, do I like it? Does it speak to me or not? You might be interested in looking at the painting as someone who's a historian of art and seeing it in its position within the canon of whichever movement it's part of. It's all the same painting, but viewed inevitably from very different perspectives. And I think a lot of, you know, magic, for me, embraces that multiplicity of perspective. So when we have a magical event take place, is it coincidence? Possibly yes. Is it wishful thinking? Possibly yes. Is it some kind of parapsychological effect that we don't yet understand? Possibly yes. Who knows? But by doing certain things, certain results seem to follow. So I think kind of adopting that position and kind of working out from there is what, in my experience, magicians tend to do.
Absolutely. That sounds a lot like chaos magic. That was my, I think we're around about the same age. I wouldn't like to guess, absolutely, but did you go through the rave kind of culture that hit Britain like a ton of bricks in the late 80s, early 90s?
Yes, in
Yeah.
a word, yes. I mean, I didn't manage to get to Castle Morton or any of the great sort of, first wave, the big summer of love, 88, 89, that kind of time. But I picked up on that sort of fairly quickly thereafter. And rave culture always seems to be a really interesting example of the deployment of psychedelics in a kind of communal culture of ecstatic kind of discovery and unity. And yeah, that was certainly a kind of an important influence on me. And I think around about that kind of time, we're also talking around about the emergence of chaos magic. So in the kind of latter part of the 20th century, here in Europe, those kinds of ideas of a sort of postmodern sorcery, which embraces this idea of a multiplicity of perspectives, starting to emerge. I think now we're getting to a stage, and we might get onto that discussion later, about like how does that evolve? How does that go further than that kind of postmodern idea of multiplicity? But yeah, that was certainly an influence on me.
Yeah, me too. So let's stick with psychedelics for a little bit more. What fascinates me is we have a personal subjective experience on whatever psychedelic takes your, I tend to use psilocybin because it's kind of local, or it used to be until they started spraying fungicides all over the place. But do you think there's a crossover point where, it starts as a kind of subjective experience, but then you kind of open up into this collective unconscious, like an Austin Osman Speer kind of idea of Kia, this group mind almost, where you encounter these weird entities. Like I've seen mantis beings, I've seen lion-headed humanoids in kind of Star Trek uniforms, big serpents. That it's not. They seem to be fairly common, but they're not like angels. They're not like demons. I'm trying to figure out where these two worlds, the psychedelic world and the magical world of angels and demons, where they come together.
I think that there's a number of ways of conceptualizing it. The way I tend to think of it is like this, and I'll try my best to explain it, that what we're encountering often in those states, we're encountering things which are, if you like, real spirits which have composed their bodies from the material that they find lurking around in our minds. So a good example of this would be to think about Jung's idea of archetypes. So within that kind of notion of archetypal structures, these are the psychological expressions of physiological facts. So there are physiological facts like human women have babies, and so there's an archetype of the great mother. There's the physiological fact that we age, and so there's the archetype of the aged wise sage. There's the physiological fact that we generally get to perhaps our adolescence, and we want to strike out and make our own identity in some sense, whatever the cultural envelope in which we find ourselves. So the hero is a real archetype, and those archetypes transcend us as individuals. They are in a sense bigger than us. They outlive us, and we are just the individual personal concrescence of those archetypes emerging into lived experience in the moment. So when we take those medicines, those substances, those drugs, one of the things that potentially happens to us is that we interact with those deep, deep structures which are embedded within the whole history of our biology. And then they arise to us in forms that we will take notice of. So they tend to be bilaterally symmetrical. They tend to have eyes. They tend to have things that we are biologically geared to pay attention to. For example, lots of spiraling sinuous forms, because we are geared up to be attentive to things like snakes. They have scuttling strange motions, so they might look like spiders. And they probably look like faces, because our biology is such that as simians, the thing we recognize very, very first of all is a face. So we don't tend to see entities that don't have those kind of characteristics. Now, that doesn't mean that the entities are purely the production of our own individual minds. They are these underlying structures jutting out into awareness, clothed in a combination of our personal history, our cultural envelope, and our own prejudices and ideas, and what we may have seen in the day before we took the psychedelic. But nevertheless, they are the visible form of these deep structures within the universe, which have a degree of independent existence and an entityhood which far transcends our own. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, that's an absolutely fantastic answer. Most beautiful. You know, the idea of like allies, like a sort of Castanedian idea of you go to this place, you make allies which will stay with you. There's a very popular idea going about in Magick at the moment of like a supernatural assistant. You know, that you have to meet like an intermediary who can help you talk with the other spirits. And that, you know, when I first got into Magick, it was pretty much taken for granted that it was the psychological model that everybody used. Of course, spirits aren't real and there's no such thing as the supernatural. But lately there seems to be a real swing back towards, spirits are absolutely all around us. You know, and by maybe taking these psychedelics, we can pull back, you know, remove the filter and see things as they truly are. You know, it's interesting how, just like music and fashion, you know, you'll get a movement and then a counter movement. So what I'm seeing just now is the rise of the traditional purist grimoire kind of dudes. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so it makes me think of several things. I suppose one side of it is, yes, occultism is subject to fashions and changes of intellectual idea and thoughts and opinions, just in the same way that any kind of discourse is. I think that one can profitably question some of those ideas by looking at practices like the creation of tulpa or thought forms or spirit beings. I think one of the things that kind of comes over from some of what I think of as fairly simplistic or a little naive kind of questions that people ask about, say, DMT entities, NN-DMT, highly visual psychedelic, or ayahuasca. The first thing is that we have this idea that seeing equals believing, which is odd in the era of deep fake, apart from anything else.
Indeed.
And secondly, we have lots of examples of processes outside of the crash bang wallop of 40 milligrams of smoked DMT, where we have all sorts of encounters with kind of entities, nature spirits, spirits of ancestors. We have things like the famous Philip experiment, which was done in Toronto in, I believe, the 1970s.
Where they created a ghost and gave it
They created a ghost.
Yeah.
Exactly. They created a ghost with a logically inconsistent backstory, which cannot have been the case. And they worked with this thing, and then they started getting real psychic phenomena. So that and tulpa and spirit thought forms and all those sorts of things also suggests that this is a co-creative process. You know, I'm experiencing you at the moment as a little tablet which is up on a tripod in my front room, and yet I'm experiencing you also as an independent thinking kind of being. So what matters is that our way of engaging with the spirits is the same the way I'm engaging with the tiny little square of my tablet that's on a tripod. I engage with it as though it is an entity, because I know that my simian strategy for engaging with other beings is the primary thinking strategy that I have. So what I don't do is I don't dismiss you and say, oh, that's not really self. That's just like a time-limited collection of pixels currently moving on the screen. That would be completely ludicrous, and it would, you know, we don't get a conversation out of it. So what I do is I say, okay, for the purposes of the exercise, even though you know, you're in this form, I engage with that entity in its own real terms using the simian process that I have. And so the flip-flop of like, now it's real, now it's psychological, well, it's like actually surely from certain, you know, the work of lots of magicians points to the idea that it's a both and rather than an either or situation. Thought forms can definitely be created and generated, and egregore can be, you know, empowered and so on. We can make these things, and we can also have these things come unbidden in the form of ghosts or nature spirits that we might encounter, or any number of other things. So I think that that's an interesting kind of area. It has to be said with the return to the grimoire tradition, I think that that's a desire for a number of things. One is a desire for authenticity. Yeah, people want to have an authentic experience, and they're very aware of the fact that, you know, there are perhaps, you know, claims that are made or things that are kind of, you know, cultivated as new versions of what, when looked at closely, seems to be the same old stuff. And so what they want is they want an authentic experience. It's also interestingly the case that lots of magicians who are kind of working in that tradition don't necessarily use things like the psychoactive materials that were being used, for example, by Eliphas Levi. So some really interesting research fairly recently published in the Psychedelic Press Journal, looking at the use of solanaceous fumigations within the magical culture of the 18th and 19th century. Yeah. So essentially, Eliphas Levi, with his one of the famous kind of evocations that he does, he describes the whole process in intimate detail. I think this is one he does on behalf of Lytton. He describes the whole process in a tremendous amount of detail, and then he says, oh, and by the way, there was incense. And interestingly, if you start to kind of go a bit further down into the guts of accounts and histories and so on, which has been done by a couple of researchers, you find that the use of things like henbane, datura, belladonna, the other psychoactives that were more commonly part of the Western European tradition, because we've been disconnected from things like psilocybin, and that itself is an interesting story. But those things were used to help bring spirits to visible appearance. And that's the case. So even within this, you know, drive for authenticity, drive for the literal and so on, there are still areas of, let's call it kind of radical uncertainty about the reality of these beings. They are definitely things that emerge from the ritual process, but very often the alteration of our consciousness to experience that emergence might necessitate the use of a psychoactive substance.
Absolutely. I think if I've learned anything about magic in the many years that I've been interested in it, is it kind of does depend on altered states of consciousness, whether it be through purification, through fasting, meditating for prolonged periods of time. But you know, this psychedelic thing just keeps up coming again and again. Look, the Picatrix, you know, the very old book on Arabic magic. There's lethal doses of substances being burnt in those recipes. You know, I'm thinking also of like Moses. I was reading a book about Cyprian, Saint Cyprian. Acacia features very heavily in his incenses. You know, is the whole history of religion and spirituality the story of psychedelics?
I think it's a major influence. I think that basically it's kind of broader than that, in as much as, just like William James says, like, we're geared up to have mystical experiences as humans. And there's a number of reasons we might think about why that's appears to be evolutionarily conserved. So we carry on doing this stuff. And one of the things about psychedelics in particular that's really interesting is to then kind of come fast forward and look at the contemporary research about how these substances can be used. So we know now, absolutely unequivocally, that psychedelics can be used to help reconnect us with parts of ourselves that have become damaged in one way or another. So to address things like post-traumatic stress disorder, treatment-resistant depression, and the kind of the fact that we can take refuge in behaviors that might be harmful to us because of our suffering, such as alcoholism and so on. We can break these things, we can change these addictive patterns with psychedelics. So they are capable of healing. They are also capable of helping people come up with, and this is kind of almost the same thing, but from a slightly different direction. They help people problem solve. So there's some really interesting research a few years back that was done with LSD, contemporary research in Britain, looking at was LSD useful for people who had kind of hard problems. So people like mathematicians, scientists, and engineers. And the answer is yes, it helps people think through stuff. The fact that we're in a pandemic at the moment, part of the testing for the virus that's used is the RNA polymerase reaction. And that was a reaction which, according to the dude who discovered it, he had the insight for how that might work while under the influence of LSD. So these substances allow us to have radically different ways of understanding the world, which allow us to heal and allow us to figure problems out, and then also allow us to feel this great deal of connection between ourselves and other people and the wider biosphere. So if you think of the mystical experience, for many people being this kind of ecstasis, being this standing outside of the way we normally are and seeing everything from a very radically different perspective, if that's part of that, and that is, you know, in a number of analyses, that's a critical part of a mystical experience, then yes, psychedelics in one way or another are certainly, if not at the root of the tree, then they're certainly part of the thing that feeds the tree that grows up into this proliferation of religions.
Absolutely. Another nice answer. Just to branch off for a little second about the pandemic and stuff, I noticed you've got your Hearty sigil there.
Yes, it has. It's lurking in the background.
Yeah, I did one today somewhere. There it is. Could you just talk about that for a little second? I think you're doing some excellent work around this pandemic.
Okay, so thank you. Yeah, I mean, this was an idea which was initiated by a magician, I think, in the United States, part of the same network that I'm involved with, the IoT. But it's kind of spread much wider than that, and it's become this kind of quite inclusive idea. And essentially what it boils down to is that you've got there a representation of the stylized form of the virus and a heart. And the message is really, really simple. The basic message is that in this time of pandemic, there are a number of ways, and unfortunately in some nations, this is what they've chosen to do. We could have completely ignored this and let this new disease just like rip through culture and kill a bunch of people, and that would be it. And actually what we've done, however imperfectly, in lots of different ways, is that people have been attempting to place care, the heart, at the center of this experience. So for example, I've been, you know, basically at home pretty much for the last like couple of months. And the reason I've done that is not because the government has told me to, it's because I know from people who I'm working with who are working in the front line of this is actually quite a significant disease event. And if I can use my practice of retreat, which is how I'm imagining it, to help mitigate the spread of that virus so we can kind of cope with this as a community, then that's really good. It's also really interesting to see how the placing this attitude of care at the heart of culture has led to all sorts of conversations about, well, how come we suddenly housed all the homeless people? How come we suddenly bailed out like vast amounts to various organizations and corporations, and should we have done that? How come we now live in a situation where the air is much cleaner than it was, and do we really want to return to that? So it's about people using that symbol in whatever way works for them to do a couple of things, to, on a kind of magical and esoteric level, be sending those ideas about placing care at the heart of this experience out into the ether, and on a personal level, cultivating their own well-being, so that when we as a community start to emerge from this, we can deal with whatever the outcomes are going to be, and we can be in a good and we can be in a really solid and good place from which we can address all those innumerable decisions that we'll all have to make as we go, you know, forward into hopefully the post-pandemic and perhaps, you know, emerging green economy kind of a world.
Yeah, it would be beautiful. I mean, I think it's quite common amongst the kind of circles that I go in that I don't like to say we've enjoyed it, but I mean, it has been a break. I haven't had to go to my rather unsatisfying, badly paid job. I've been able to like sit out in the back garden. It's been beautiful weather this weekend, for instance. I've been noticing things that I've just never really paid much attention to before, the habits of birds and how they interact with my cat and all that kind of stuff. I think magical people tend to be more grounded and comfortable in their own skins, and I think that's one of the main reasons for, you know, a good reason to start practicing magic and start playing with the idea of improving yourself through the techniques of magic.
One of the things that I've noticed is that kind of hubris aside, people who have an active engagement with their spiritual process, let's call it that. So they might be religious, but not necessarily. They might be religious and not have an active engagement with their spiritual process. That's entirely possible. Or they might be artists and they might have some other kind of way of doing it that doesn't look like religion or magic. But people who are actively engaging in their spiritual process are generally, I think, adapting to this time and seeing their way through it quite well. And that includes people like myself who are kind of, in quarantine, in lockdown. And it also includes people who I know who are working in, intensive treatment units and working in the kind of the medical field and the caring fields. And the reason for that is really simple. I can't remember who the quote is from, but there's someone who said once that an atheist is a man with no invisible means of support. Mm-hmm. And what you need in a situation like this is you need to have a process of nourishing your soul. Yeah, you need to have processes that do that, because it's really difficult time now. It's a difficult time on many, many levels, and it's going to carry on being that for a while. So to have something that nourishes you and something also that kind of supports you, but as alongside that allows you to kind of like open up, not to kind of to lock down into, oh, this is how it has to be. Because it's about holding that uncertainty and being able to sit with that and being able to acknowledge the value of that. That's something that I think a spiritual practice, whatever form it takes, is really how that, that's really, really beneficial to people. Now, when I was commissioned over the course of this time, I've been commissioned to do some NHS well-being videos, which are absolutely magical techniques, but just with all the magic language stripped out of them. Yeah. So techniques like sit there, imagine that you're opening set of 4 imaginary windows around you, and in each imaginary window there's a representation of one of the 4 elements. It's like maybe a beautiful beach that you've been to looking out across the sea. Maybe it's a beautiful campfire that you remember sitting near with all your friends. Maybe it's a fantastic landscape that you remember looking down on. Maybe it's like being able to be somewhere where you're astonished by the clouds that are over the landscape. Yeah, so you're bringing yourself into a relationship with the elements. It's absolutely magic tech, but without any of that language. Simply because there's a lot of people going to need those skills, going to need those techniques, which have benefited us. And for my part of my work as a teacher is to bring things to people in a language that works for them, to aspire to do that. So being able to share those techniques and being able to present those in ways that people find accessible, I think is really important. This is what I've been doing anyway.
Yeah, excellent. So do you have a daily practice?
Yeah, it's incredibly boring. It mostly looks like sitting meditation and a bit of body work. So most of the time, that'll be my practice. And then there'll be more elaborate stuff. Obviously, kind of, in situations where we were able to meet physically doing ritual. I was in a temple meeting last night, in fact, where we had, I can't remember how many of us, like 20 of us or something, online, and we were doing various ritual practices. So the group that I'm part of, the IoT, the Illuminates of Thantiros, we've been doing online forms of magic for quite a long time. So when the lockdown happened, it was like, okay, guys, well, we're just going to go to this, to that platform and work there. So yeah, my core practice is work on the body. The body is the first temple, so working on that, trying to make sure that I've got a good kind of, I'm in as good a shape as I'm realistically kind of able to do. So a bit of exercise, and for me that looks like a mixture of like yoga, a bit of freeform movement, a bit of Tai Chi, stuff I've picked up over the years that I'll just like mash up depending on how I'm feeling and what feels like it needs a bit of work. And then and then doing some, usually seated meditation, and usually just absolute, mindfulness of breath, that will do. And then other practices as and when those are necessary or when they emerge.
I noticed online when I was reading blog of Baphomet, which I'll get onto in a second, that you're doing an elemental workshop quite soon. Hopefully, is that online? That'll be an online course.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah. No, I was working on that today actually. So Yeah, so I do quite a lot of workshops with Treadwell's books in London, and obviously they're doing amazing stuff to kind of keep their offer to the magical community kind of up and running in the pandemic. So I'm going to be doing elemental magic. We're going to do some left-hand path tantra. We're going to do a special masterclass on banishing and centering. We're going to do something on the Kabbalah, specifically the magical Kabbalah, and then I think something on psychedelic ritual.
Nice. That's the magic that I do is I'm working through the elemental, self-initiated and all that from a manual that, funnily enough, my friend got from Treadwell's. It fell off the shelf right at her feet. So it was like,
Uh-huh.
that's the one. And, I'm not particularly Christian, Judeo, but I found the Golden Dawn system has been mightily effective, really. I've recently started the practicus stuff after kind of Theoricus was a very difficult grade for me. It was all airy and I was floating about all over the place and doubting everything and picking everything apart with my over intellectualizing and skepticism. But now I'm just going with it. So, on to this spooky, crazy, scary figure, Baphomet. Who is he?
Uh,
Who is he? Or it? He, she.
or he, her, they,
Yeah.
whichever pronoun one should use. Okay, so I mean, we know the backstory. We know the story of the Knights Templar and the bust that happened at the end of the 1200s, and that whole kind of half-heard whispering of this word that may have actually been Muhammad and all of that sort of stuff. And eventually, basically, the meme pops up with our friend Eliphas Levi again, and he produces that amazing kind of like image of Baphomet, and then the shaggy and hooved thing goes off into culture and it proliferates into innumerable forms. And I guess that's one of the things for me that I find really interesting. So I was interested in, I was fascinated by the character of Baphomet. Oh man, so like, seriously, like since I was a kid, 40 years, way before I was able to kind of, the internet even existed as a way of kind of getting the memes. And I kind of heard that Crowley had used the word, but there was something about the word that really appealed to me. And it appealed to me partly because it was this idea of, my first magical influences were things like Wicca with its duo theology of a god and goddess. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool, but I actually wanted something that was this, like a hybrid mashup of like male and female and the above and the below and all those sorts of things. And when I got involved with the IoT, I guess about 20 years ago, obviously Baphomet was one of the kind of figures that they were using quite a lot within their kind of ritual structure. And having spoken to Pete Carroll about it, he picked it pretty much as arbitrarily, as like, no one has actually owned this thing yet, I'll try and do it. It could just as easily have been Abraxas, which was the other deity that was in the running. So I think for me, it's a character, it's a figure that points at a big kind of complex of ideas. I like Pete Carroll's idea about Baphomet being the emblem of the sum total of all the psychic life force in the planet at any one time. So I guess in some of my practice, I use it as almost a synonym for great spirit, or God, or goddess, or insert your favorite word there. I like the fact that it's a deity that kind of doesn't have a myth or has a sort of a half-heard historic backstory, but has come to be this deity associated with all kinds of different things for all sorts of different people. It's like having this malleable clay that you can turn into whatever form you want. So yeah, so I guess for me, I think of it a lot as the quality of and this is pretty much to paraphrase something that Nikki and I wrote in the book of Baphomet, which is the fact that physics gives rise to chemistry, chemistry to biology, and biology to awareness. That process is what I describe as Baphomet. That process of the insensate clay that you and I are made from, the carbon from the ancient dead stars, that arises into awareness of things like awareness of our own DNA and our own evolutionary process. So this self-aware aspect of Gaia, if you like, I like to glyph that as Baphomet in my own kind of, personal history, and there's a bunch of other people that kind of groove on that way of thinking about it as well.
Nice. Very reminiscent of the ideas we have of Pan and stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the things I think that's really interesting is that if you look at something like Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton, where he talks about the backstory of the emergence of Wicca, he talks quite a lot about Pan. And I remember actually being at the inaugural lecture where Ronald took his seat as a professor in Bristol, and he did this most astonishing lecture about Pan. Pan in the ancient pantheon is a very minor league god, but Pan really comes into his own in the 19th century. And the reason for that, as Ronald so beautifully describes both in the book and also years ago in this lecture, is that at the beginning of the 19th century, 80% of people in Britain lived in rural situations and 20% in urban spaces. And by 1900, that figure had reversed. Yeah, so by 1900, 80% of people are in cities and 20% of people are in the country. And so what that does is it creates this hankering for a kind of imagined bucolic Arcadia. And so all of those people, Arthur Machen in The Great God Pan, there he is in The Golden Dawn, also writing this amazing novel. There's people like, the things like The Wind in the Willows, and all that Victorian iconography of Pan that starts to appear is partly a response to a sense of the loss of connection to wild nature. And wild nature, like in Pan, is glyphed as being both this kind of beautiful, Sylvanian Arcadia, trees and so on. And it's also kind of at the same time in a sort of folk horror way, it becomes this threatening, scary, powerful, I guess what I would describe as like a deep magic. Yeah. So yeah, there's part of what Baphomet is Baphomet stands their shaggy hooves definitely on the shoulders historically of Pan in the 19th century. And this difficulty that we are wrestling with at the moment, the pandemic also brings into sharp relief about our relationship with the biosphere. Like there's some big problems out there. We're kind of like a teenager that's woken up in the disarray of their bedroom and gone, oh man, what happened last night? And also realizing, as again Baphomet kind of points to for me, is that there ain't no aliens coming to rescue you. There's no God in heaven above in that kind of sense. You have to do this. You self-aware beings who've realized the place is a mess, you've got to tidy up. Yeah, no one else is going to do this for you. And if you don't tidy up, the rest of biology will just rearrange itself eventually around you, no matter what hole you plug in it. You could detonate all your atomic weapons tomorrow. Biology is going to carry on. But how embarrassing to face the creator of the universe or creatrix of the universe and having to explain that because of one of Donald Trump's tweets, you annihilated the first attempt at consciousness on the planet. I mean, I don't want to carry that shame. We shouldn't do that. There's other stuff we could maybe enchant for.
Fantastic. So let's go back to the chaos magic thing. Where is chaos magic in 2020? I think a lot of people see it as something that kind of briefly flared and took over for a few glorious years in the early 80s maybe, and then kind of crept off somewhere. Obviously it's still a living tradition. What's happening with chaos magic nowadays?
Okay, so I think if we answer that question broadly, I think that what's happened with any good idea and any kind of magical crucible of ideas is designed to explode, or perhaps more positively, I suppose, or less worrisomely, to detonate like a flower or like a seed head. Yeah, so off it goes. So chaos magic was this kind of attempt at a postmodern, eclectic style of magic that didn't have a theocratic envelope around it in the way that Thelema arguably does or might be seen to do. It didn't draw its roots on an imagined history like Wicca, or on a set of recreated, let's call them, texts by in the way that Druidry does. And so it kind of, with its formation within the IoT, this idea kind of generated and was proliferated out into wider culture in the same way that postmodern philosophy kind of went into wider culture. So it's kind of there. It's now in the background. Like people who are highly eclectic wizards or magicians or whatever, they wouldn't necessarily define themselves as chaos magicians. They wouldn't need to. But the fact is that chaos magic made some of those significant kind of changes. Where does it go next is a really interesting question. I've got some ideas about that. I think that, you know, whether we call it chaos magic or whether it is just magic or whether it ends up having another tag name, who knows? But there's a kind of I think, an emerging philosophical strand within a thing called metamodernism. So metamodernism is this idea of that you've got the flat idea of kind of post-modernity, all discourses, all opinions are as good as anyone else's. And then the metamodernist thing kind of says, well, that may be the case, and there may be something to be said for having lots of different views. But there's also a kind of there is a teleology and there is a trajectory. So what I've just said about us as human beings needing to reconnect with the biosphere, I think that that is true in a variety of senses. I'm not necessarily saying I know exactly the process by which that should happen, but there's nevertheless this idea of this evolution or a progression or a getting into better relationship or getting into a process of unbinding ourselves. However we see this process, that's essentially it has a teleology, has a trajectory, has a project, has a thing it's going to do. It's not just about, oh, now I'm going to have this belief system and this approach, now I'm going to do this. There is still a kind of a narrative, a grand narrative, as people would have said in the modernist kind of philosophical sense. So I think that the new forms of magic emerging might do two things. I think they might acknowledge that people have a project, people have a thing that they're attempting to do. You know, this idea of like a process beyond just exploring all kinds of different things because they happen to be there. And I think the second thing is that in Pete Carroll's work, he's not very good at citing people. And I think that one of the things that we can do a lot better now is to say, hey, my name is Julian, right? And my style of magic looks like this, and it's drawn from this tradition and this tradition and this tradition and these teachers and these teachers, and these are my roots, yeah? That's what's happened to me, and I want to acknowledge and respect those people. If I represent their work, I'll try and cite who they are and quote them and just explain that, like, this doesn't come fully formed from the head, you know, it's not like Athena coming out of Zeus's fonts, you know, it's like we're part of this process, part of this tradition, and acknowledging and respecting those influences rather than just pirating them and not giving them the honor that they're due. And the second thing, like I said, is this idea of like, and this is my magic, and my magic is about the following things. It's about things like placing the idea of care and our understanding of our relationship with each other and the way that thing might be mediated in the heart of the pandemic. It might be things like my belief that we have to really radically rethink the way that capitalism and our culture works in order to get into a better relationship with the biosphere. So it's not, and we, you know, this is it also, it's an ongoing conversation. It's not like a fixed ethic. It's like an ongoing set of like negotiations and process, and keeping things very open in the way that postmodernity is, but also saying, and this is where the stuff is drawn from that I'm building, and this is where I'm trying to head to.
Yeah, I think that was what was so enticing and interesting when I first found Libernal and Psychonaut. You know, I'm living in the north of Scotland. It's hardly a magical hotspot. We had one little comic book where we used to get a few wiser titles, The Eye in the Triangle, I got to remember, and this weird book, Libernal and Psychonaut. And it seemed very, you know, very postmodern. It wanted to overthrow the established order. You know, I saw a quote somewhere about Pete Carroll saying that astrologers should be strangled with their own intestines or something. You know, but obviously you can't keep up that kind of punk rocky spitting on everything. You know, it's kind of settled into the mainstream of magic now, and like everybody kind of coexists pretty happily, really, as is evidenced by My Magical Thing, where you've had people from every tradition, from druids to traditional magicians to, you know, so I think that's really nice that there doesn't have to be flame wars and, you know, all that bullshit.
No, totally. And of course, just as an aside, the funny thing about Pete Carroll's kind of statements about astrology is that I wouldn't necessarily take them all at face value. Yes, they are deliberately incendiary in some respects, but also if you look at things like the Epoch, the Portals of Chaos deck that he produced a few years back, which, you know, it contributed at least being the model for one of the cards. It's entirely based around astrology. It's what it's based around. It's based, or about certainly the vibe of the classical planets. So he takes, you know, what would Saturn and Mars together, which deity would that be? So each of the cards is kind of based around actually what is one of the core magical systems, you know, the use of astrological and planetary magic. But yeah, I mean, a lot of those people, going back to the stuff about my magical thing, a lot of those people I've worked in ceremony with in one way or another, you know, like, so Dave the Bard, Dave Smith, fantastic. You know, he and I've participated in Druid rituals, and he's been part of kind of, you know, groups that I've worked with. So I think that, like a lot of movements, like a lot of kind of, I don't know, if you start to look at music or any field of human activity, people imagine that there are these little discrete compartments, and actually, like, a lot of people know each other, and a lot of people have been and done stuff with the, you know, collaborations and work with other participants, you know. So I think by and large, you know, it's a community of humans like any other. People have falling outs, people have difficulties, people go off the rails and go a bit crazy. It's a thing. But by and large, I always think that, you know, if you're going to aspire to work with spirits, the spirits that you most often encounter are other people. Yeah. So if you can keep like a reasonably positive relationship with most people most of the time, yeah, by and large, because again, you know, Pete Carroll, for all his posturing, there's a lovely bit in, I think, Liber Chaos, where he says, I think it's the section on wealth magic, where he says the most important thing for me in terms of wealth is my address book, which is not what you would expect from someone who, at least ostensibly, has presented himself as, you know, I'm a terribly successful businessman and whatever. So he's saying, look, the most important thing is my connection to these other people. These are my allies. This is my community. This is where the richness actually is.
Beautiful. Again, you're such a wonderful speaker. I could listen all day. So do you still do like results magic? Do you do spells for specific things? I imagine you just kind of work on yourself and, you know, like a theurgic working towards the great spirit in the sky. Do you still do, you know, I need 500 quid quickly, quick sigil?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the last time I can remember really doing something like that wasn't actually that long ago. I remember being broken down in Tor Bay in South Devon. It's not a place you want to be broken down, particularly at dead of winter. And I had one of those apps on my phone that allowed you to make sigils. So yeah. I kind of eventually totally lost the plot after the dude hadn't come to pick me up for however many times it was. And, you know, typed in that, you know, I want this guy to turn up now or whatever it was, some sort of naive request, and scrambled it and was about to, like, I don't know, do funny breathing or something and look at it very hard. And at that point, I heard a sound. And so I just kind of unthinkingly, I sort of opened the door of my car and found the guy driving past. He'd been given my phone number, but with one digit inaccurately. And of course, that makes all the difference. So he'd been driving around for ages trying to find me. And as I started to cast the sigil, he appeared. Now, of course, I don't know. I can't rerun the experiment. I don't know what's going on. You know, I have no idea. I know that with certain things, certain results appear to follow. So do I still do results magic? Yeah, occasionally. It's a thing. But mostly what I aspire to do is to do like, I guess what you're pointing at, like a sort of self-refinement process, which looks like lots and lots of different practices, of which the body work and the meditation are the core. And then if I have a desire to achieve something, there's several things that I think come from that. Firstly, when we talk about results magic, people often sort of start it with the desire, and that is really, I think that's a mistake, because you have to think about, from where does this desire arise? Who is this desiring individual? So the individual that you and I are now in this moment is continuously being updated and changed. And the desire that we have when we're 5 and when we're 15 and when we're 25 and 50 may be very different. Yeah, so we're continuously editing these things. So in a way, what you want is a desire to arise, which is in accordance, if you like, with the unfolding nature of the universe. And so you might then just place attention in certain places or do certain relatively simple acts, and that's an attempt at then taking that emerging desire and finding ways to actualize it in the world, which I know maybe sounds kind of like a little bit kind of wishy-washy. It doesn't, sometimes it turns into like ritual behavior, but sometimes it just turns into much simpler things. I suppose in a way, although I think Alan might maybe have slightly different views now. If you take something like Advanced Magic for Beginners by Alan Chapman, he talks about the purpose of magic being something, I can't remember exactly the phrase he uses, but to realize the nature of truth. And what he's kind of pointing at, I think he's pointing at this idea that the process of doing magic is this kind of, it's more like a revealing of things. So it's more like, instead of doing a ritual to get your 500 quid, it's more like a process of refinement that allows it to become more likely that you find the financial resources necessary to actualize the things that you want to achieve. So it's more about, rather than just narrowing down like a laser point of desire, sometimes that's necessary, occasionally that's absolutely necessary, but it's more to do with like a widening out of perception so that that which is needed is noticed more readily.
Yeah, I think with magic, I'm sure you know 30 years of work, you start by thinking it's something, and the further you go down the line, it keeps changing. And for a while, I couldn't even define what magic was anymore. I was like, I'd read too much, I had so many competing ideas, but it should. It's like the psychedelic experience as well. I've noticed like paradoxes seem to suddenly resolve themselves, and you're like, I've got it, Eureka. But then just trying to take something back from that, I've found it very hard to. I've had such profound psychedelic experiences. Then when I'm trying to describe them or explain what I got out of it, it's like, well, I'll try a cut up or something. It's very hard to bring an object back from that weird.
Okay, so there's like a couple of things there. I mean, I hear what you're saying, man, because there's, in one sense, magic is like Crowley wrote an essay called "The Soldier and the Hunchback," which is the soldier is an exclamation. Exactly. You know the one, right? So it's just like, that's the universe. The universe is a question, is a process of going, huh, ah, huh, ah, huh, ah. That's what it is. Yeah, it seems to me. If you're in the journey of kind of self-revealing and discovery and exploration, is, that's what we would hope for. And if you're interested in the occult, you're interested in that which is hidden, there's always going to be like a revelation. It's going to be a continuing kind of process. And then I suppose when we go to things like psychedelic experiences, or those kind of high mystical states, however they're induced, when we come away from those things, we can describe them in language, but we have to describe them, we have to be really careful, because we can't describe them directly. We can only describe them through metaphor. We can talk about visiting another world. I visited another world. Now that's a perfectly intelligible sentence. And of course it makes arguably no logical sense. Or Maya Deren, one of the first women, Europeans, to be inducted as a Haitian Mambo, a priestess. And she described the experience of being possessed by the Loa as I think it's the descent of the white darkness. Right, it makes no logical sense, but of course it points perfectly to it. We even have a word. We say things are ineffable; they cannot be expressed in words, but we have a word for that. And then everything else we have to build is metaphorical and poetic. And the other thing I think, in response to what you've said, is that sometimes what we want is a middle-size idea. So Terence McKenna does this brilliant rap where he talks about somewhere in the vast amount of lectures that he did. He says you can have a big idea, which is like, wow, the universe, wow, it's all a big thing. Or you can have a small idea, like, isn't it amazing how your little finger fits perfectly up your nose? Isn't that remarkable? But what you actually want, like in fishing, is you want a middle-sized idea. You want to pull something back that you can then take away and go, oh, and therefore this is what I need to do. So in therapy, in psychedelic therapy, what you're looking for is you're looking for a metaphor that allows the person to then address whatever the thing is. Their alcoholism, for example, or their trauma. Yeah. So trying to kind of get those middle-size ideas, those kind of a meaningful metaphor, which can then allow you to kind of go on to whatever the next stage is for you. And that just takes practice and work, and also knowing that the journey's not done till the fat lady sings, I guess.
Yeah, I
You
mean,
know,
it's never,
I expect and imagine that I'll have, if not very different views, then at least I'll have other experiences to draw on in, God's willing, however many years' time.
yeah, it's never finished, is it? Like, oh, I'm an pessimist now. I can just rest on my laurels. It's never finished. It's a constant
Never
revealing.
finished. It's never finished. If nothing else, the tree itself, even if you think about it as 10 balls and 22 sticks, you and I both know that within each of those sephira, there's another tree and another tree and another tree. It's like a fractal system.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so you're enlightened. Fantastic. You still got to chop the wood and carry the water. Big deal. Nice one.
Yeah. Fantastic. I think that's probably, what was your last book? Was it the psychedelic, what's it called again?
I'm trying to remember. I think it was,
very many books, Julian.
I think the most recent one is, pardon?
Getting Higher, the Manual of Psychedelics.
No, so there's Getting Higher, which was 2017, and then there's another one called Walking Backwards, which is the psychedelic art of psychogeography, or the art of psychedelic psychogeography. It's just the short one that I did with Greg Humphreys. And then there's another one, which is a collection of essays called The Fool and the Mirror.
Yeah, I read an essay, one of them this morning.
Ah, right.
Beautiful.
Okay.
It's like describing a trip you'd had around about where you live, and yeah, very beautiful. You're an excellent writer, fantastic speaker, very inspirational, and my magical thing that's going to keep going through the lockdown.
I've got another 5 that have already been filmed that I'm in the process of kind of editing and getting ready now. And yeah, a bunch of other people who said that they'll come and play ball. So yeah, looking forward to talking to lots of people about it. I'll come back to you at some stage, Sharath, and I'll love to see your magic.
I mean, there's so many things that I meant to talk about, and I try and keep it down to about an hour because, But Julian Vayne, thank you so much. I'm totally honoured that you chose to come and speak with me on my little insignificant channel. Thank you very much. You're a man of the people. God bless, mate, and I'll see you soon, hopefully.
Nice one, man. Take it easy.
Right, cheers.
Thank you so much.
You too, man.